Since we have at this point been over a good few of the technical particulars of rendering and surfaces and lighting and all of that, it would be remiss of me not to mention something about the art of lighting. Now, the purpose of this tutorial series is to, of course, teach you how all of the tools and techniques in Lightwave operate. To bolt on top of this a course in studio lighting, photographic lighting, artistic lighting would be ever more stuff, and it is not going to be the focus or purpose of this tutorial series. This series really is just about the tools and techniques that we have available to us in Lightwave. Now, once we get onto the projects section and we start setting up some of the lighting there, we will talk about some of the artistic choices that we're making, but we won't be exploring the reasons and the forms in any real great detail at all. However, similar to the way that we talked about the fundamentals of modelling and texturing, there is this additional fundamental of having good lighting design if you want your renders to look half decent. Simply slapping in an object and pointing a light at it is not always going to give you that great a render. It might look physically good, it might look physically accurate, you might have, really good PBR materials and you've got a good model and you've got great textures, but if it's not well lit, it is going to be sold short. Now, of course, if you want to know more about artistic lighting techniques, it's not difficult to find plenty of information for free on the web. Just give it a good old Google. Cinematic lighting here, lots of different bits and pieces. We've got a few articles, we've got some, YouTube videos. If we're more interested in, studio type setups, portraiture, product shots, stuff like that, studio lighting techniques, here's a whole bunch of stuff. Here's a good little article here on pop photo that covers a few basics, such as here, an external daytime portrait. The model is backlit. You can see from the brightness of the reflection coming off the sea there and the blown out highlights that she's being lit from behind. So the photographer has employed a bounce card that he's holding to give her some fill light. So this is a bit of backlight and fill light. Here, a food product shot, a very messy food product shot by the looks of it, but it's just natural daylight, but they've used as well a spotlight, which apparently, according to the article, has a small colour to help give the food more richness there. We've got this sort of action shot of some dude outdoors, and you can see the big bright speculars that we're getting on his pecs, and of course his six-pack, his muscles over here, and they're really helping to, show off the sculpted shape of his form. If the lighting was flatter, you might not see this as well, but of course with this kind of lighting design it makes the sculpture of his muscles really pop. You can see there he is shot from below with these strong spots that are focused in on him like that to give those highlights. Bits about jewellery here, again product shots to get the reflections and the sparkle and how you position your lights relative to the camera. You can see here nice soft boxes to give high sparkle and of course reflect back to the camera from their angle. And here we have a product shot, which is a brochure shot for this car. Lots and lots of lights going on in the scene, and as it says here, lots of lights keep it dark. Of course you see that we've got dark sky, dark buildings behind, dark road. All of these things, when you then light the vehicle, help it to really pop off the page. If the entire scene was well lit, daytime, lit up road, lit up everything, then the car would just sort of disappear into the scenery, as it were. Whereas here it becomes the focal point, and that's done through the lighting design. So I'll leave you to do a more in-depth exploration of all of that in your own time and in your own way. But to start with, let's just have a basic crash course in just some of the basics. The most fundamental aspect of lighting design is using lighting to describe our scene and set the mood and tone. A simple example might be something like this, that old cliche of telling ghost stories with a flashlight under your chin. This has a couple of effects. Firstly, done in a darkened space, your body and everything else is in shadow, and so your brightly lit up face starts to give the impression of this disembodied head, which is a little creepy and unnerving by itself. Secondly, the angle of the light casts these deep dark shadows. You get these pools of darkness forming around the chin, coming off the nose, and most notably in the eye sockets. As such, the light starts to pick out the details of the skull more than it's picking out the details of the normal living face. It gives an air of malice and uncertainty to the composition. And even though it is a very different mood and a very different kind of design that we're going for, the principle is very much similar to that muscle guy on the beach there. We're using the light to sculpt out certain details and reveal those whilst hiding or obscuring others. For instance, here we have a Pegasus, and it all looks perfectly fine, you know, we can see it, no problem, we can realise the whole thing, and that's nice enough. But where's the interest? All our lighting in this scene is doing, it's just sort of floodlighting everything and making us see the entirety of the model. And maybe if you're, you know, showing off a model, showing off a mesh that you've built, then that's what you want. But of course, a lot of the time it's not. So what about something like this? You know, we've just got the single light in here, and it's more contrasty, it's more, you know, dramatic in a certain sense, but it's still kind of flat and boring and a little bit dull. But of course, as we change that angle, then, you see, we start to reveal the shape in different ways. How about putting our light at this sort of angle? Now look at what we're getting. You know, the musculature of the neck is starting to show up more. We're understanding the shape of the mane here, even though we can't really see it that well. The just way that the light is playing off it is giving us this sense of it. Look at the wings. We're only getting the, you know, trailing edge of them, but we get the idea of them sweeping out from this creature. How about something like this? You know, it's from the front, the light is high and pointing downwards, so we're getting this long shadow here, but of course you see his belly and his rear legs are retreating entirely into shadow. We start to almost get the sense of this thing, especially because of its pose, the way it's rearing up like this, as if it's rearing up out of the darkness itself. We get a sense of it emerging into the light. Another thing that our lighting can do for us is help give us a sense of scale. For instance, here's our statue, you know, just sat in front of a big old light there. How big is it? What does it look like? Does it look like some enormous, you know, towering statue, or does it look like a little statuette that you might have on a desk? How about now? Which way does it look now? Does it look larger or does it look smaller? What sense does having these multiple lights down low and small in size give to it? What about when we change their brightness? What effect does that appear to have? What about when we throw some other lighting into the mix, such as to catch the rim here, and also throw in a dose of colour? How does that change our impression of this? Of course, when trying to understand lighting and its use and how it creates different impressions, it's always good to have a little thumb through art history and see the way in which artists over time have gradually learned to use lighting in new ways. You will find that for a long time, especially during the medieval period, there was very little use of lighting in paintings. They were very flat depictions of things. In fact, for the longest time, people hadn't even discovered perspective. As you move into the Italian Renaissance, you start to see a good deal of that feathering out, though you do still get echoes of it, such as here, Raphael's depiction of the Academy, which of course, having shading under the arches and shadows cast off of the characters, but still maintains the entire scene as quite well lit overall. It's not flat like many of the medieval works, because of course you do still have shading in the cloth and, as I say, shadows from the characters. But the lighting that you're using here is really to describe, or rather display, an entire scene. You might, for instance, wind up doing something of this nature if you're doing an external architectural visualization or something. You just want to show off a building nicely lit on a bright day. Of course, as you get into more detailed lighting, then the key thing that you start to see coming in is contrast. These contrasted areas either between light and dark or between different colours. For instance, something of this nature where you've got a number of little workings of contrast. You've got the darker shadowed area down here, and you've got the brighter area up here. But of course down here we're catching sort of a low sun, so we're getting yellowy orangey tones, and you see that reflected in the orange tunics and the red garments of these folk down here, whilst of course up in the opposing corner we have these blues. Of course, once you really start pushing the contrast in lighting itself, then you wind up going into this very Baroque sort of style where you have lots of heavy blacks contrasted with these much more strongly lit areas, and this very sort of sharp transition between light and dark. A style of lighting that today is very dramatic, cinematic, and indeed stage-led, but which you see originally pushed by painters, of course, like often most famously Caravaggio, creating these high contrast scenes to really force your attention onto the characters and of course the expressions, the details and wrinkles of the face, whilst trying to obliterate almost everything else. This stark transition between light and dark, this heavy use of bright light and deep shadow, usually referred to as chiaroscuro, you'll see is quite a popular theme in art, going back some years, but of course into the modern day as well. Very popular in black and white and portraiture, not uncommon in cinema, but as well as being useful for objects, it can also be useful for depicting places, creating these sorts of senses about how light works in a space. Have a look around, you will find there are a number of sort of architectural visualizers who have a taste for this sort of style. Even when you don't go so extreme, of course, you will still find that this use of contrast between more strongly lit and less brightly lit areas, or the contrasts of colours, very commonly blues set against oranges and yellows, or perhaps when you have nature in the frame contrasting the greens with the browns. All of these things will help to increase the interest in your image. And of course, even when you do have things fully lit, nice and brightly, you can still take this idea of contrasted light and shade into areas like your specularity, along with things such as your Fresnel, so that you pick out reflections of items to trace their contours rather than lighting their contours and otherwise having them in shadow. Using reflection in this way allows you to pick out the edges and the details of shapes while still fully illuminating the object. So when it comes to all of these different options and practices and styles and techniques of lighting, I'll leave you to look through and explore and discover for yourselves what you like, and of course to try applying them to your own setups and projects. But in the meantime, to get you started, we'll just have a run through the most basic of all lighting technique setups, which is the 3-point lighting setup. And so when you're trying to do materials or objects, this can be a good setup to use to get yourself a nice looking render. So as the name suggests, it uses 3 lights, most usually referred to as the key, the fill and the backlight, sometimes the main, the kicker and the rim. Different people do like different names. Here's the basic idea of it. We start out with our main light and we place that off to the side somewhere of our view, our actual camera. Let's get our camera and just dolly it in for a shot here, shall we? And let's say we're just going to take a slight side 3/4 view of our object here. So we would place this off to one side of our camera, which side doesn't really matter, but off to a side like this to light in this way. Now often this light will be reasonably bright, as this will be the main key light for your scene. So there we go, something like this perhaps. Often, rather than just having it flat here, you might have it high up or low down and tilted to point at your object somewhat. In this case, I'm just going to use the light flue there. I'm going to have it a little lower and just tip it up slightly so I get this slight uplighting effect. Also, this will often tend to be your main shadow casting light, so you might find that you want to have sharper shadows on your key light. So there we go, there is that. Next we'll have the fill, so let's switch back to our top view. We'll just clone this light, and the fill basically just sits on the other side in opposition to the key in some respect or other. There we are. In this case I'm going to raise it up a little and just make it a bit more face on like that. Obviously at present that's the same brightness and of course sharpness, so what I'll do is I'll just soften off the shadows of this fellow. Look, that might make a nice key light over there, very bright, but no, that's another way round to do it of course, and we'll make this dimmer. No, dimmer still. There we are, so we see it's just providing a small amount of lift there to the lighting. You can often as well, give these little colour casts, help pick them out from one another. Start to accentuate their contrast with each other a little this way. And then lastly we'll have the back or the rim light, which will do a thing similar to that which we did before with this Pegasus statue, which is just to light it from above and behind here, over here I guess. There we go, just picking off the edges there, and often we'll come off to one side or the other. In this case I'm going to come off to the same side as the key. Make this light white, and I'm going to make it very, very bright indeed, whilst also making it quite sharp. And there you go. It is, of course, nothing particularly special, very quick, very simple little 3-light setup, but we are catching some shadowing in here without having too much overly harsh shadow. We've got some of these bright lines that are helping to pick out and display our form and our shape, and we've got a bit of contrast going into the different colours there. We give our surface just a touch of specular to help accentuate some of those highlights a little, and there we go, a simple render, simple lighting setup that's got a bit more interest to it than just a plain flat lighting would have. So I hope you'll have a bit of an explore through different lighting techniques and how to create different senses of scale or mood or senses of a space with different lighting, and that with that you'll have a crack at getting more creative with your own projects.